Lord is full of loving favor and pity, slow to anger and great in loving kindness. The Lord is good to all, and his loving kindness is over all his works. The eyes of all look to you, and you give them their food at the right time. You open your hand and fill the desire of every living thing. We're talking about common grace today, and there are two terms that systematic theologians of a certain type have used to describe God's grace: saving grace and common grace. Saving grace does exactly what it says on the tin. This is the idea of God's lavish generosity in rescuing creation from the darkness. This term, as it's been used, has particularly emphasized God's rescue plan for humans from the effects of sin and darkness. It has a bit of a tendency to make salvation only about humans rather than all of creation, but it's not a bad term. Saving grace. The second term, common grace, is the idea that God lavishly continues to give all kinds of people all across the world blessings in 1,000 million ways. It's the kind of grace that's common to all people, whether they notice it or not. And unlike saving grace, which is for all who follow Jesus, common grace is the idea of God's generous gifts for everyone. I find the strong dividing line between these two types of grace rather artificial. And like all systematics, like all systems, it attempts to neatly categorize according to a frame of reference, which is okay, but not perfect. And it tends to be subject to ignoring or not noticing when something doesn't quite fit within these neat categories. But be that as it may be, common grace and saving grace, those terms are actually pretty helpful. However, generally, these terms can give meaning and give understanding to what grace is. I just want to blur the lines and the boundaries a little bit between the two. So today we're talking about common grace. Whatever the fall in God's creation looks like, common grace says that despite this fall, despite this turning away from God, God is still everywhere, pervading all things. He is everywhere to be found if we have eyes to see. And that sounds strange to us because we have breathed in the air of deism, the idea that God has left the building. We've breathed in that air all our lives. God is far away, having left the earth to its own devices, and we have been surrounded with an assumption that nature does its own thing independent of God's actions. He started the natural processes and is now distant. But that's not the biblical view as far as I can tell. Paul says to the Athenian philosophers in Acts chapter 17, "In him we live, we move, and we have our being." In other words, we can't do anything without God being close, whether we realize it or not. And this is really hard for us who live in the modern, postmodern world, whether we realize it or not. It's the air we breathe that says God is at a distance. And it's really difficult to really get a handle on this and to really absorb that sense that God is present in all things and at all times and in all places. So when the writer to the Hebrews in chapter 1 says this, "It is the Son who holds up the whole world by the power of his word." When he says that, we're kind of a bit, yeah, kind of. We tend to think, well, it's gravity and it's mass and it's a strange cocktail of physics and maths that holds up the world, all of which is true. But the Bible doesn't contradict that, but says there's a deeper magic, as it were. It's like a fish in a goldfish bowl. All it perceives is wetness. All it can perceive is wetness. It can't comprehend dryness. It can't perceive that its world is contained within a bigger environment or what that could possibly look like. The little figurine of the mermaid in the bottom of the bowl has just always been there. And the food that falls down once a day is just the way things are. Common grace says God sustains, is involved in, blesses and cares for all of creation all the time. We could talk about some examples. Firstly, from the physical realm. In Matthew 5 verse 45 it says this, your Father, his sun shines on bad people and on good people. He sends rain on those who are right with God and on those who are not right with God. The cycles of days and seasons, in other words, have a sustainer, the Father, says Jesus. Or Paul in Acts chapter 14. Long ago he allowed all people to live the way they wanted to. Even then God did not leave you without something to see of him. He did good. He gave you rain from heaven and much food. He made you happy. The goodness of creation didn't just happen purely by chance. God gave it. That's the physical realm, but think about the intellectual realm. Lies come from the father of all lies, the devil. But humans are not totally given over to that. All people are able to have some grasp of the truth. Because as John 1 says, that this is true light coming into the world, the one who gives light to every person, every human being. All people, in other words, have an instinct for the divine. There is still something of the image of God left in human beings. All people have some ability to grasp truth and wisdom and knowledge. And humans can grow in that knowledge. That means that science and philosophical thought, technology, medical advances, and so on and so forth, these are all results of common grace. So when you ride in a car or eat some manufactured food that came from South America, in some senses, common grace is at work. The grace that enables people to think and plan and create ways of providing for humanity. This is the common grace of God, poured out on all mankind. There's an old joke about human arrogance that goes like this. One day a group of scientists got together and decided that humanity had come a long way and no longer needed God. So they picked one scientist to go and tell God that they were done with him. The scientist walked up to God and said, God, we've decided that we no longer need you. We've got to the point where we can clone people, manipulate atoms, build molecules, fly through space, and do many other miraculous things. So why don't you just go away and mind your own business from now on? God listened very patiently and kindly to the man. After the scientist was done talking, God said, very well, how about this? Before I go, let's say we have a human making contest. To which the scientist replied, okay, we can handle that. But God added, we're going to do this just like I did back in the old days with Adam. The scientist nodded, sure, no problem. And the scientist bent down and picked up a handful of dirt. God wagged his finger at him and said, put that down. You get your own dirt. Let's also think about the moral realm. God is still at work when people have a sense of conscience. Romans chapter 2 says this, they show that what the law wants them to do is written in their hearts, the idea of conscience. Their own hearts tell them if they are guilty. There are other factors that motivate us to do good, certainly, than just the conscience. But that instinct to protect the family, the sanctity of marriage, to make laws that serve society, to prohibit theft and murder, that core morality, even though it's expressed differently across the world in different cultures, is still a sign of God's pervasiveness in human hearts and minds. And Jesus comes and wants us to take that sense deeper. He says in Luke chapter 6, if you do good to those who do good to you, what pay can you expect from that? Sinners also do good to those who do good to them. So he wants folks to go deeper than just the moral conscience. But he acknowledges in saying that, the reality of that moral conscience, that all humans have a sense of doing good. We could go on, we could talk about the creative realm and how common grace impacts the arts and the media and music and so on. We could talk about the societal realm and how common grace comes to us through the agency of governments and agencies that seek to preserve the good and protect the weak and restrain evil, or businesses and voluntary associations or human friendship, all these ways in which the societal realm reflects the common good of God's grace. We could talk about the religious sphere, the religious realm as it were. Unbelievers often have a sense of wonder or gratitude. There's nothing worse, it seems to me, than being really grateful for something and having no one to thank. Michael Caine was asked about what beliefs he had, and he said something to the effect, I don't really believe in anything, but I do wake up each day and I'm thankful for this gift. Thankful for a gift? A gift implies a giver. Being thankful implies someone to be thankful towards. That's common grace. There's an instinct there, a kind of nagging sense that there is more to this than meets the eye. So what am I saying by all this? Common grace is something that restrains sin, is God's continued generosity in sustaining and giving life, and provides a window through which to glimpse the Creator of all. It is there to point us towards God's goodness and mercy. He's not against us. He loves and continues to give if we will but notice. Of course, he wants to take us into saving grace, and that requires some specific knowledge about Jesus and so forth. But it can begin with just this sense of common grace. Wow, there is something more than just this goldfish bowl. So how do we respond to this? Well, firstly, we pray for all the people we know to have a sense of common grace. Begin with yourself, because out of this will flow such a great sense of meaning and thankfulness. And faith ceases to be a set of rules and rather an overflow of gratitude. Notice common grace in everyday life. Sometimes Christians have an understanding of saving grace, and it's others who are different to us, and they are everybody else. I'm saved, they're not. Let's be those who have a profound sense of wonder at how generous and close this God we talk about actually is. It has to begin with us. And pray for those who don't call themselves Jesus followers to be awakened to wonder and the gifts of life, but also to take that deeper, to turn that wonder into a search that leads them towards Jesus. Second thing in response to common grace, I would say this: embrace God's gifts in God's world. Hear this: just because the devil says 1 and 1 equals 2 doesn't mean it's wrong because the devil says it, right? All kinds of people do good things. All kinds of people. Some organizations and businesses are net positive in terms of what they give humanity. Some inventions do wonderful and great things that help human beings. All this is ultimately from God, and He deserves glory for it. But this also means we can embrace with curiosity and adventure new things and don't need to be overly wary. It is part of the common grace. Curiosity, adventure. Of course, all things can be turned to evil, but let's be those who notice God's hands in the ordinary gifts of life, whether that's music and art or technology or ideas that seem confronting perhaps. Of course, we acknowledge that the darkness seeps into all things, but have a default of being embracing and celebratory rather than prohibitive. And never be like the Christian leaders of my youth who thought jeans were of the devil. Third and final thing to say in response to common grace is this: be like God. There's a simple command, be like God. Do good to all. God is lavish, God is generous, even when humanity often fails to acknowledge the divine presence. We are to act as God's image. Small imitations of the real thing. Common grace says that we should serve and be generous and be imitators of Christ. We live in a world that is gifted and abundant, so live graciously towards others. Luke 6 says this, love those who love you. No, love those who hate you. Do good to them. Let them use your things and do not expect something back. Your reward will be much. You will be the children of the Most High. He is kind to those who are not thankful and to those who are full of sin. In that passage, Jesus says we are called children of God when we emulate his generous love, his common grace. Let's learn to do that.